Welcome again. We'll talk about the final class for class 8 history NCERT. In this chapter we will talk about the situation of India post independence. Till now we have talked about the Indian national movement, how the Swadeshi movement took place, then you had the non-cooperation civil disobedience, and finally the Quit India movement that laid as the foundation stones for the India's independence. Now coming on to the situation after independence. As we said, we were happy with the independence, but this happiness came along with the riots that occurred because of the partition of India. So as a result, we had nearly 8 million refugees that entered India from Pakistan. At that time, there were nearly 500 small princely states in which the country was divided, and this was a kind of pathetic state because the consolidation of these princely states was a big issue, and Sardar Patel was the leading man to work around the consolidation of these states in India. Now in 1947, when we got independence, the population was around 345 millions, but that had a huge distinction between high caste, low caste, rich, poor, Hindus, Muslims, and so on and so forth. So these were some of the issues that we need to address that time. Again, the situation of women, the situation of farm economy, the cities which had developed had huge amount of slums and squatter settlements, so all those need to be addressed. During this time, we witnessed another tragic episode with the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi by Nathuram Godse, and he basically disagreed with the Gandhi's idea of Hindu-Muslim division, Hindu-Muslim unity, and he said that India should have been divided solely. Now coming on to the drafting of the constitution. During the period of 1946 to 1949, you had the drafting of the constitution that took place, and finally on 26 January 1950 we had the constitution that came in its final role or its final shape. Some of the important elements discussed under this was adoption of a universal adult franchise. That means all Indians who are above 21 years of age would be eligible to vote. Now this was not the case in other nations. In other nations, initially only those who had property could vote. Later on, this idea of having property was extended to the educated class, and finally after a long struggle, people who were working were also allowed to vote. But India from the very beginning gave everyone the right to vote, all those who are above 21 years of age. The next is equality before law to all citizens. Despite being Hindus, Muslims, Christians, or belonging to any other religious community, everyone was placed equal to law. The next was abolition of untouchability. So the Hindu temples were now open to the untouchables, the so-called untouchables that time. The Dalit discrimination which existed was slowly and gradually rooting out, and B.R. Ambedkar was one of the major leaders who worked around this. Similar to the privileges that were given to the disadvantaged, you had privileges for scheduled tribes or Adivasis that were given, so they were also given reservations. The powers was divided between the center and the state. Now there were three types of powers that came up. The union power or the union list that had power solely vested into the center. So like defense, taxation systems, you had foreign affairs, all those were under the center. Then you had state. State talked about the powers that were vested exclusively for the state. For example, health. However, there were certain issues that were in the concurrent list. So education, then you have forest, agriculture, all those became a part of the state and the union list, and therefore you have the three lists that were used during that time. Now Hindi was declared as an official language of India. However, there was T.T. Krishnamacharya. Krishnamachari, he gave a warning that if Hindi is declared as a sole language of India, people of South would separate out. So already India had witnessed one partition with Pakistan separating out as a different nation. India did not wanted to have more further internal conflicts. As a result, a resolution was given in which Hindi was considered the official language of India, but all court proceedings, all legal texts and all the issues which were interstate between the two states would be pursued only and only in English. So that was one of the important elements that were discussed. B.R. Ambedkar we already talked about. He worked around for the development or the upliftment of untouchables during that time. He himself belonged to a Mahar community, which was a kind of untouchable community during that time. Later on, he was called as the father of Indian Constitution, as he had one of the major roles in drafting of the Indian Constitution that was finalized. Now, formation of states was very important. In 1920, before the independence, Indian National Congress said that if we get independence, we would separate out the country based on the major linguistic areas in India. Now, this statement, which was given prior to the independence, gained momentum, and after independence people started working around the right to say that we need to develop these areas and we need a separate state for a separate linguistic region. So that was again one of the major issues that were discussed. But during that time, the Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and Deputy Prime Minister Vallabhbhai Patel both were extremely against this idea of dividing country into different states, because already we had witnessed a kind of huge breakdown in the nation and we did not want further disruptive tendencies to emerge out. Despite of this fact, there were protests going on throughout the country. The strongest protest came from the Telugu speaking Madras presidency, and the person who was protesting for this was Potti Siramullu, and Potti Siramullu basically talked about a separate state for the people of Andhra. Now, he went on a fasting and ultimately died. He was not able to achieve the goal that he meant for, but his followers revolted. Because of this death, the idea or the protest intensified into that region, and finally Andhra was the first state to separate out in India. So the new India that was formed after independence, you had Andhra, which was later known as Andhra Pradesh, was the first state to be separated out. In 1956, States Reorganization Commission was set up, and they were talking about ideas working on the various provinces based on the languages for Assamese, Bengali, Telugu, Tamil, Odiya speaking and Malayalam speaking people. Now this was the state with the princely states of India and the British India during that time. Now later on you had in 1950 you had Maharashtra and Gujarat that was separated. In 1966 you had another separation that took place as Punjab and Haryana. So all the 6 went to the Punjab and all the Hindi speaking Haryanvis went to Haryana. So you had another division that took place in 1966, and later on you had numerous divisions. 2 recent divisions were in 2000 you had Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, and Jharkhand, and the last one separated from Uttar Pradesh was Uttarakhand. So 3 of the states separated out in 2000, and in 2000 you had Telangana separated out from Andhra Pradesh. So these were the separations that took place recently, and still you have numerous areas where people are still working forward for a separate state. Now the states that were newly made ceased to exist as a princely state, where the prince agreed with the merger to the Indian state. So all those which were till now princely states became the state of India, and finally you have the new India with all the 29 states as of now. Now again, since we got independence, planning at that time was very important. So you had the establishment of Planning Commission that took place in India in 1950. The key idea of Planning Commission was to work for growth, for self-reliance, for equity, and for separation of powers. So all those became the sole idea, and you had the private sector and the government sector that started to develop. The vital or the key industries were kept with the government sector or the public sector, and slowly and gradually some of the industries were outsourced to the private sector. We will talk about this more in economics class 11 chapter 2, where we would be talking about the development post the planning commission was set up. So all those are again very important. A very important step was the second 5-year plan, which was laid down or formulated on the ideas of P.C. Mahabalonis, and he was one of the major architects of the later plans in India, known as further the architect of 5-year plans in India. Now in 1956 you had a key focus on the heavy iron and steel industries in India. So you had the Bhilai plant that came up with the Russian collaboration. Similarly, in 1949 you had Mirabai, who said that with science will come desolation. So if we want to progress, we should not exclusively focus on science, but we should aim to maintain a nature's balance. That is very, very important. During this time, World War II was going on. Now there were two superpowers in the world. One was the British power and the other was, one was the Soviet power and other was the American power. Now both the Soviet and the American powers were looking for the collaboration from India. India, with Nehru as the Prime Minister, had a separate stand. So India said that it would neither align to the Soviet powers nor it would align to the American powers, and it would remain isolated or neutral. So during the World War II, India said that we will neither support the Soviet nations nor we would support the American nations, and we would remain neutral, and this came to be with the formation of the NAM or the non-aligned movement. With India, you had other nations, other countries that joined India with the same motive, and those were Egypt, Yugoslavia, Indonesia, Ghana, and later on, after a few years, you had numerous other countries which joined this idea. So Krishna Menon led the Indian delegation to UN between 1952 and 62 and argued for the policy of non-alignment. You had the new independent states which participated in the conference that took place in Badung, and the Asian nations continued to oppose the idea of colonialism, still prevalent in many of the Asian countries. Now if we talk about the present day situation, we have seen that we have worked around, or we have gone a long way with the freedom of press, independent judiciary, separation of languages, separation of states, but still there are some issues that we still need to check around, like the issues of discrimination, the issues of Dalits, the issues, the various clashes between religious communities, and bridging the gap between rich and poor. Dharavi, which is one of the world's biggest slums, lies in India. So we need to still bridge the gap between the rich and the poor. Again, talking about the similar things that were going in other nations. So you have the case of Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, Sinhala was declared as the official language of Sri Lanka in 1956. And for many years, you had a civil war that had took place in Sri Lanka. The root lies in the imposition of Sinhala as the official language and the Tamil speaking minority that exists in Sri Lanka. So if you look onto the map of India, you have the region of Tamil Nadu and then you have Sri Lanka. So you have huge number of Tamil minority, not huge number, since it's a minority, you have Tamil minorities in this nation of Sri Lanka, and there are constant clashes between the Sinhalese and the Tamil population there, because Sinhala was declared as the official language of Sri Lanka. So those are some of the issues that took place internationally. With this we cover the class 8 NCERT history completely. We will be moving forward with class 9 history in the upcoming classes. So definitely stay tuned. Don't miss the further lectures. Have a very good day ahead.